So this is the second seminar in our brand new series of genomic lectures. The Genome Center is a unique academic collaborative enterprise that really, in my mind, of course I'm a little biased being the president here, but is a wonderful brand new exemplar of the way science and medicine are going to move towards the future. In many ways, much like how we think physicists have moved towards understanding of the Higgs boson. So the goal of the New York Genome Center here is to try and combine interested physicians, scientists with technology to produce clinically actionable change for people. And of course, to do that involves many layers. It involves the physicians themselves and the scientists, it involves the machines, it involves computers, and it involves other things that are below the surface, such as ethics, data warehousing, security, issues that are very, very complex to tie together. So one of the reasons I'm so excited to have Millie here is that we are trying to build in the very bricks and mortars of the New York Genome Center, how we can transform medicine in a big scale that's going to affect humanity. And to do that has to tie in with ethicists from day one. So I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you here. Please join me in welcoming Millie, and pleasure to have you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Darnell, for this invitation, and it's really a pleasure to be in this beautiful, beautiful building on the cusp of this inauguration of such a wonderful institution. Thank you. As Bob said, I'm the president of the Hastings Center. The Hastings Center is an independent, nonpartisan research institute. We were the first bioethics center in the country, founded in 1969, and we've developed a worldwide reputation for purposely bringing people with diverse views into the same room to discuss morally uncertain and potentially very contentious issues in health, healthcare, biomedical research, and the environment. The center, in this beautiful building, fulfills really three roles. One is that we do our own scholarship. We have resident scholars at the Hastings Center, and we also have a large circle of nearly 200 bioethicists who are Hastings Center Fellows, who are an elected group of the world's top scholars in bioethics who we draw upon for special research projects. We also serve the bioethics community. We have two journals. The Hastings Center Report, which you may know about, is a major journal in the field of bioethics, and then a smaller journal called IRB, which serves people who are interested in human subjects protection, people who sit on IRBs. And then we have two blogs, and we have a visiting scholar program. For example, last year, 61 scholars came from 18 countries and 11 states and stayed with us in the upstairs part of that white annex. Third thing we aspire to do and do is to have impact in the public square. The kinds of questions, the ethical questions that are raised by science and technology are profound. And we think it's important that educated citizens should be able to weigh in, not just experts, and that we have an obligation to translate the scholarship that we do in a way that makes it accessible and seeks input from members of the public, ordinary citizens. And we do that through a variety of means, including a really strong relationship with the media and through public events we sponsor ourselves, as well as events like tonight's. We're located in the beautiful Hudson River Valley, and I like to remind people in my New York City talks that this is only an hour and 10 minutes away, and you get to have this beautiful view for at least half of that time up the Metro North Rail line. This is the view from our front lawn. We have many visitors, and we have an open door policy, so we have a tradition of lunchtime talks. If people come to visit us, we can coalesce a small group very informally, and by virtue of your presence here tonight, you've all bought tickets for a free lunch. I also want to acknowledge a couple of our board members who are here, and the Hastings Center would not be what it is without their support. Harriet Rabb and Andy Adelson and his wife Nancy are here, and if people want to learn more about the center in the break, take a look, try to find Harriet or Andy and Nancy. Okay. We live in an age and in a nation of extraordinary scientific and technological prowess. Through the efforts of scientists like those of you in the room tonight, we've mapped the human genome. We're able to sequence whole genomes in cost-effective ways. Microbiologists and engineers are getting together and mixing DNA to create new life forms. It's extraordinary. It's breathtaking. And it offers enormous promise for relieving human suffering and building a healthier world. But the new knowledge and the new power we've gained also raise profound questions. Questions that are not only scientific in nature, but also philosophical. Questions about our notions of what it means to be human and what kinds of communities we want to build using these new powers that we've created. These kinds of questions, the non-scientific questions, demand collaboration between scientists and non-scientists, bioethicists, philosophers, humanities scholars, religious leaders, and the general public. So tonight I'm going to talk about one topic where dialogue between scientists and non-scientists is really essential. And I'm going to spend most of my time, or at least half of my time, on the Nazi eugenics example, but on Nazi eugenics. But eugenics was really a worldwide movement, and the Nazi experience brought it to a different, implemented it at a scale that was unheard of. But it's important to know, even though I'm going to be telling this story about what happened with eugenics under the Nazi rule, that it really was a worldwide movement aimed at human improvement. The goal of the international eugenics movement was to increase the birth rate among fit families, and that was a term of art, and reduce births amongst those classified as unfit. And it was a movement that was advanced by many scholars and respected leaders in Britain, in other countries in Europe, and in pre-Nazi Germany as well. Its pinnacle was roughly the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Now, I'm focusing on the Nazi story for 3 reasons. First of all, as I said, it's the setting in which eugenics was implemented most radically. The second reason is I have access to riveting primary source photographs that I'm going to share with you that demonstrate and document the extent to which physicians and physician scientists were instrumental in the Nazi eugenics program. And the third reason is that as an extreme case, it's a history that we can use as a foil to talk about how is it different now, but also what are some of the similarities and things that we should be on the lookout for. Now, most adults are aware of the virulent anti-Semitism of the Third Reich and of the Nazis' annihilation of European Jewry. And the name Mengele is well known as a synonym, really, for a monster physician who carried out so-called experiments on concentration camp prisoners. But many fewer people are aware that well before the Holocaust, but continuing through it, the Nazi regime waged a eugenics campaign against its own citizens. That wasn't necessarily or particularly focused on Jews or other quote-unquote non-Aryans, but focused instead on people who were deemed unfit and that didn't match their notion of racial purity. And a symbiotic relationship existed between the medical professional elite and the Nazi regime. Nazi policies supported public health measures that many physicians had already come to embrace years before. And so the profession was sort of ripe and ready to come on board because they were already interested in this kind of human biological improvement. And therefore, physicians particularly, but also other healthcare professionals like nurses, had active involvement and became the literal means, in ways that I'm going to show you, of affecting Hitler's plans. It was a marriage based on convergent goals. In addition to eliminating the non-Aryans, it was seen as important for the health of the nation to eradicate feeble-mindedness, physical deformity, alcoholism, blindness, and deafness. More than 400,000 German men and women were sterilized, many through orders issued by hereditary health courts. And these courts were made up of geneticists, physicians, anthropologists who offered a patina of respectability. And then between 1935 and 1945, in that 10-year period, more than 200,000 Germans, including 5,000 children, living in state long-term care facilities, were killed as part of a so-called euthanasia program. Hitler looked to professionals in medicine to help frame and implement public policy. And as I say, it was easy to win physician approval for the eugenic policies because they coincided with many eugenics views that were prominent at the time among physicians and scientists. So I'm going to try to answer, in the time I have with you, 3 questions that I think this case lets us get to. How can it be that how can it be that this happened, that physicians and nurses worked actively in collaboration with the Nazi regime to sterilize and kill undesirables? The second question is, how did that work? I'm going to show you some of the primary source historical material that kind of shows the process by which they were recruited. Although they weren't really recruited, they were leading the way. And then in the last third of the talk, I want to talk about how our contemporary efforts to improve human biology are different from, but also maybe similar to, the early eugenics movement, and hope to raise some thoughtful questions more questions than answers, that could become something that we continue to talk about over time. Okay, so to begin with that first question, how did this really happen? We have to turn to the historical context, and starting with the end of World War I. Many Germans thought Germany was losing the battle for survival because of the death and destruction of World War I. After all, Germany had lost the war and had lost nearly 2 million fit young German men who had died fighting. And the memory of that was visible all around them. There were millions who were also crippled. And there were deepening German fears about the falling birth rate and biological degeneration. It was in this context that 2 Nazi leaders, Binding and Hoch, wrote their justification for the destruction of unproductive elements in society. And here is a poster of the time. The translation is 2 million dead, referring to the World War I soldiers who died. Did they die in vain? Never. French soldiers. Adolf Hitler is showing you the way. This was a Nazi election poster. And here, this quote, "If one imagines a battlefield covered with thousands of dead youths, and then our institutions for idiots and their care, one is most appalled by the sacrifice of the best of humanity, while the best care is lavished on life of negative worth." There was also a concern at this time in Germany about increasing costs of care in an economy that was dislocated and under duress. And so these eugenic ideas became the remedy for reversing both the loss of the fit and concerns about degeneration and the concerns about cost. Hitler came to power in January 1933 in the midst of an economic, political, and constitutional crisis that paralyzed the German government. See if this sounds familiar. The right and the left were each strong enough to block policy, but not strong enough to rule Germany alone. President Hindenburg turned to Hitler as a way to break the deadlock. So he enters power and he gets elected, entering as somebody who is hoped will actually bring the 2 sides together and create a more functional government. And he enters as a junior partner, and that's the way he framed himself. And notice his body language in this picture, where he is showing deference to President Hindenburg. However, once he was in power, we know what happened. He quickly moved to establish a one-party dictatorship. And here's the interesting thing. He had this insight that he was going to rely on the support of non-Nazi professionals. So here's an example in the non-health sector, but it makes the point about how clever this was. He resisted the calls for special prize positions. He was kind of moral in the way that he was saying that it was going to be a meritocracy that was based on professional expertise. And so he stated very publicly that professional qualifications were very important. And he was also wise enough not to try to take the SS on the one side and replace the local police. Instead, he put the SS next to the local police. This is a Berlin police officer and an SS person who were doing rounds together. So both the emphasis on professionalism and the political savvy not to fight the powers that be already, but to join them and just have this be a parallel collaborative effort. And so he did the same thing in recruiting support for his racial hygiene policies. Let me see where I'm going here next. Okay, these are some of the things that predated Hitler. This was in the 1920s, and it was part of that worldwide movement. But you can see this. I'm showing them as an example of what was in the atmosphere that he was able to capitalize on. So this pamphlet urged couples to be informed about health, including the genetic health of their potential prospective spouses, and it advised citizens to learn about the family health history of anybody they were going to marry. A 1932 exhibition called Healthy Woman, Healthy Nation focused on maternal health as the means to lowering infant mortality and birth defects. But as Hitler gains power, he builds on this in extraordinary ways, both in a positive, quote-unquote, positive eugenics effort, which is meant to improve the fit families, and a, quote, negative one, which is meant to get rid of the undesirables. As part of the so-called positive policies, the Nazis awarded a prize called the Honor Cross of German Motherhood, right here. I can figure out how to use my pointer. Yeah. And this woman, the prize was segmented by how many kids you had. So the bronze went to women who had 4 or 5 children, the silver to women who had 6 or 7, and the gold for 8 or more. And this mother is wearing an honor cross in 1942, straddled by her oldest daughter and her youngest. The next graphic is from a popular household manual written by a doctor. It shows the concern with women's reproductive health and child health. Nazi Germany took the lead in pointing out the dangers of alcohol and nicotine. The Nazi state was the first to ban smoking in public buildings. So this helps us understand why physicians and scientists welcomed the Nazi emphasis on public health policies, why they embraced eugenics, and in so doing legitimized Nazi power. Of all the German professional groups, physicians were the most represented occupational group in the Nazi Party. An example is Dr. Ernst Rudin. He was an academic psychiatrist who directed the very prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry in Munich. In 1933, Dr. Rudin helped write the new national compulsory sterilization legislation. It wasn't only the emphasis on professionalism, it wasn't only the fact that people had this orientation towards biological human improvement that had already been around for a couple of decades. It was also because the Nazi government created new career opportunities and established a major funding source for people who wanted to do research in eugenics. And you can see the way in which medicine was deployed in all sorts of ways. So more money for this kind of research, career advancement for this kind of research, and then here you can see the metaphor, Adolf Hitler as doctor of the German people. This is the cover of a medical journal. and yet it's got him on the cover of it. So you can see the narrative that's going on here. Now, I said that Dr. Rudin drafted the original sterilization legislation. I'm going to give you a copy of it here. It shows the text of the law that he drafted. Anyone who is, I don't know if you can read that, but anyone who's hereditarily diseased can be made infertile through surgical intervention, when, after scientific medical evaluation, it is to be expected that the offspring will suffer hereditary physical or mental damage. Now, this kind of legislation had been tried before the Nazis, and it didn't work because it was vigorously opposed by liberals on the one side, who were concerned about infringing on rights, and by the Catholic Church, who saw it as an unnatural interference with human reproduction. But all of that opposition was silenced, primarily because of the imprimatur of medicine. And I'll just show you one more poster from this era that shows that the role that concerns about cost played. You are sharing the load. A hereditarily ill person costs 50,000 Reichmarks on average up to the age of 60. So it's this convergence of all these issues. Now, how did the sterilization process work? It established hereditary health courts to decide about questionable cases of sterilization, and these courts were staffed primarily by doctors and one judge. Doctors, social workers, teachers, hospital workers, prison directors were supposed to propose candidates for sterilization from among the people that they served in their various healthcare settings. Doctors were required to register with these courts every known case of a quote-unquote hereditary illness. In effect, it was the doctors, not the Nazis, who played a role in deciding which human characteristics were desirable or undesirable, because they were picking out who should go to these courts and get sterilized. And a major diagnostic category for this was feeble-mindedness. Not very well defined. Of the 400,000 Germans who were forcibly sterilized, over 250,000, about 260,000 of them had that label of feeble-minded. And that was the reason that they were sent for sterilization. And I want to end this part of the talk by sharing with you the human face of the people for whom this happened. This is Gerda D. She had a purported diagnosis of schizophrenia. It was never really established. And this is particularly sad because not only was she sterilized because of a purported diagnosis, but she was doubly harmed because she later sought a marriage license, and another related law did not allow marriage unless the couple were fertile. And so she was also forbidden to marry. Okay. Now, that's part one. That's on the sterilization campaign. I want to tell you about the euthanasia campaign. And I won't go into quite as much detail because I want to save time to talk about the contemporary issues, but you need to know a little bit about this. Basically, this was a program of murder in mental institutions and long-term care facilities. But unlike the sterilization campaign, which I just showed you had a law behind it, and at least a patina of legality, this was a secret program that was carried out under the quote-unquote cover of war. Karl Brandt is another doctor, Dr. Karl Brandt, one of the physicians responsible for implementing this killing program, testified at his trial after the war that Hitler realized that killing the incurably ill or the vulnerable in nursing homes would be easier during wartime, since the public resistance from churches would not play such a prominent role, and it would be easier to cover up in wartime. To provide some semblance of looking like it was legal, Dr. Brandt asked Hitler for written authorization. This is the authorization he got. It was signed by Hitler at the bottom. And it basically gives physicians enormous power. They are charged with responsibility to extend the powers of specific doctors in such a way that after the most careful assessment, those suffering from illnesses deemed to be incurable may be granted a mercy death. Now, note that he backdated this to September 1st, 1939, which is the day Germany invaded Poland. Again, trying to link this program to look like it was part of the war effort to confuse how it was perceived. It was given the code name Operation T4, a reference to Tiergartenstrasse 4, which is where it was headquartered in the Berlin Chancellery office. It was completely run by doctors and nurses, and it was they who carried out almost all the operations of it. And it depended on very careful planning and deception. The program targeted adult patients in all government or church-run sanatoria and nursing homes. These institutions were instructed by the Ministry of the Interior Ministry to collect questionnaires. Here's one about the state of health and the capacity for work of all their patients. And these were presented as though they were kind of just something the government was just interested in doing, a statistical survey. These questionnaires were filled out by doctors and then used by other assessor physicians. But once they were filled out by the first doctor, then assessor physicians read them and decided which patients would be killed on the basis of how this questionnaire was filled out. A very sad, sadness on top of sadness. Some of the physicians who wanted to help protect the people they were caring for thought mistakenly that these questionnaires were meant to find able-bodied people who would then be taken off to the war front. That they thought that Hitler was trying to find people that they could put behind a gun. So they even made them sound more unfit, and that sent more of them to this program. And physicians were paid for filling these out. It was piecework. They got paid by how many questionnaires they filled out and rarely ever examined these patients. That's a close-up of it. There were 6 euthanasia centers around the country. People were taken from the long-term care facilities where they were living and brought to one of these 6. This one is called Hadamar, and the slide shows smoke rising from the euthanasia center at Hadamar. It was a photograph that was taken by a farmer. And the next photograph is the death registry there. You can see down here where it says these causes. They actually thought this through so much that they had 60 causes that you could put on this questionnaire. Doctors faked the death certificates. They faked the cause of death. And got paid for filling them out. Most of the doctors picked pneumonia because that was like the thing that seemed the most realistic for a long-term care facility. The next slide shows the degree of planning about what the cost savings would be. And so that one patient consumes 700 grams of marmalade per month. Each kilo of marmalade costs this. Over 10 years, this is how much we will save. So this gives you a sense of what happened in Germany, but we shouldn't get very complacent. I want to proceed now and tell you a little bit about what was happening in the United States in the 1920s, just before all this was going on in Germany. And again, you're going to see physician scientists playing a prominent role. The precursor of the American Genetics Association, which I think still today, you tell me, you know this better than me, publishes the Journal of Heredity. Its precursor institution was the American Breeders Association. And in 1912, they issued this report. Now, the American Breeders Association had 3 different divisions. Its goal was to improve the stock of plants, the stock of animals, and the stock of humans. And it was called the Eugenics section. And it was broken into committees, and the committees all reported in this report. There were separate chapters for each committee. So here are these chapters, and you see these same words that we just saw in Germany. Feeble-mindedness, a committee on insanity, a committee on all these things, as a committee on sterilization. So this is 1912, the United States. At the first International Congress of Eugenics in London in this same year, the primary author of this report declared that people of defective inheritance should be eliminated from the human stock. He pointed out that the U.S. Census data from previous decades demonstrated that the number of people in institutions such as prisons, hospitals, and asylums totaled over 630,000 and was growing as a big percentage of the population. He, quote, he said, another 3 million people of inferior blood were not yet in institutions, and 7 million others, 10% of the American population, according to this author, were carriers of hereditary maladies. All told, this mass of problematic heredity was, quote unquote, totally unfitted to become the parents of useful citizens. What I want to emphasize with this slide and this part of the talk is the prestige of the people involved. This year, 1912, the head of the American Breeders Association, which issued this report, was James Wilson. He was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. He was the longest-standing Secretary of Agriculture ever, 16 years, serving 3 presidents, McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and Howard Taft. He was Secretary of Agriculture under Taft when this report was issued from his organization. And furthermore, the American Breeders Association's Eugenics division, I mentioned they have 3 divisions, the Eugenics division created a very high-profile and distinguished advisory council with scientists from Harvard, Cornell, Columbia, Cold Spring Harbor, Princeton, the University of Chicago, and Fordham. Another major American leader here in the U.S. was Charles Davenport. This is a lecture that he gave in 1910 at Yale. Same kind of language. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you'll see the same sort of positions were taken. So we shouldn't get too smug. We also had our own fitter family efforts. I showed you the award for the Mother of Honor in Germany. Well, we had our own state fairs, which were promoting international eugenics, and I don't know if you can read these, but they're quite amazing. I'll see if I think I have it here. The signs are, the lights are going on, right? And it says, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. This is from Kansas. And below, one side reads, the light flashes every 15 seconds. Every 15 seconds, $400 of your money goes to the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives. This other light flashes every 50 seconds. Every 50 seconds, a person is committed to jail in the United States. Very few normal persons ever go to jail. End quote. And this is another view of what these state fairs look like. You can see they had their own buildings called eugenics buildings. And perhaps the most infamous case in the U.S. is the case of Buck v. Bell, which established the legality of American sterilization laws. We had sterilization laws ourselves in 29 states. And eventually there was a decisive case that was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court when Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was presiding in that court. It was brought by Dr. Bell, who was the superintendent of a state institution where Carrie Buck and her mother were living. They had lived there for years. Carrie was unmarried. She already had a daughter out of wedlock, and she was pregnant again. And so the superintendent wanted her to be sterilized, and eventually the case went before the Supreme Court. And you're probably all familiar with it because of this very famous excerpt from the Chief Justice's decision. We have seen this decision validated all the states' sterilization laws, made them blessed. We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices. But doesn't that echo what we saw just a few minutes ago about the framing of the soldiers in World War I that began this in Germany? The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So, does this have anything to do at all with today? And are there any lessons that we can draw? When we use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or any of the numerous prenatal tests, are we practicing eugenics? If we are, is it wrong? Maybe it's not wrong. Francis Galton, was the first person to coin the phrase eugenics, and its literal meaning is good in birth or well-born. And he used the term to bring attention to his desire to improve human biological functioning. He was a cousin to Charles Darwin, so it's not really surprising that he got genetics. After the Nazi era, and after all of the horrible stories I've just been telling you, the term eugenics lost any chance of ever having a neutral meaning. But it did originally have a neutral meaning. And for a very long time now, though, of course, it's been synonymous with something horrific. But very recently, many commentators, many of them from within the world of bioethics, are advocating a new kind of eugenics, and they're using that word. And they're saying that it's one that's based not on state authority, but on personal choice. So one of the prominent bioethicists who's making this argument is Julian Savulescu of Oxford University. He's a Hastings Center, one of those 200 Hastings Center fellows I mentioned. And he was asked by a journalist about whether we're practicing eugenics today. And here's his answer. Oops, no, that's Francis Galton. Okay. It depends what you mean by eugenics. In point of fact, we practice eugenics when we screen for Down syndrome and other chromosomal or genetic abnormalities. The reason we don't define that sort of thing as eugenics, as the Nazis did, is because it's based on choice. It's about enhancing people's freedom rather than reducing it. So, one critical difference between eugenics then and now, if you're willing to use that word in a neutral sense, is that today, parents, not the state, make these decisions. In the early 20th century, state power was used to deny the human rights of the individual. In contemporary society, decisions to prevent the birth of children with certain characteristics are made by the people most likely to be affected, that is, by parents, not by the state and not by doctors. Now, if you think the major harm of the eugenics programs I've described is that they stole the human rights of the individual women they sterilized, then you might be happy with Savulescu's answer. And you might say the key thing is that it's not state-imposed, that it's personal choice. And we certainly see the value of personal choice. We think it's a way to respect persons, to give them choice. So if you agree, then that could be the critical difference. And you could just say, this is totally different. There's no bearing between this now and then. There are other bioethicists who think that just because it's choice is not enough of an answer. It's not enough of a difference. Just because something is in the private realm, and here's where I really want you to think with me, because this is going to get into a variety of different shades of gray. But I'm going to assert, for the time being anyway, and we can debate and discuss it in the questions and answers, that just because something is in the private realm and is an individual choice doesn't necessarily mean that it's benign, especially when millions of individual choices could add up to making a really large impact on the nature of human populations. In other words, consumer-driven genetic decisions may not be that much less problematic than state-mandated forms. Individuals responding to social norms of health, attractiveness, the desire for intelligent, beautiful children, and so forth. Parents, under those circumstances, may want to alter the characteristics of their offspring and even demand to do so. This kind of eugenics would be market-driven and socially norm-driven. And people who've commented on this have called it a variety of different things. It's really different variations on a private eugenics. They've called it backdoor eugenics, market-driven, laissez-faire, or user-friendly. And I'm going to share with you what those critics say. And then, if there's time, it would be interesting to have reactions to that. They have three concerns with laissez-faire, with private choice eugenics. Three concerns have been in the literature. First, there's concern about whether the prenatal testing that we do and the prevention of people who would eventually have a disability could lead to discrimination against the disabled. And I'm going to try to quickly summarize a really large literature. One of the most important papers was on the pages of the Hastings Center report, A Not-So-New Eugenics by Robert Sparrow. He points out that as social norms change, parents who may not want to terminate a pregnancy may feel compelled to do so in response to social pressure. And then he poses in this article a disturbing thought experiment. He asks us to consider the possibility that sometime in the not-too-distant future, people who do choose to continue a pregnancy that results in a child with, say, Down syndrome or some other disability may be seen as imposing the additional costs such children require on taxpayers. In circumstances like this, where a great majority of people opt to terminate, and there are many fewer people with Down syndrome and other disabilities as a result, hostility to people with disabilities may increase, and willingness to build supportive services for them might diminish. So that's one concern, that just to say it's personal choice might not be enough. We ought to think about that. Now, another set of concerns have to do with maintaining the conditions necessary for choice itself. So you can say it's okay because it's personal choice, but you still are obliged to say, is it really choice? How robust a choice is it? Let me explain what I mean. Are we maintaining the conditions for fully informed choice? As social norms change, what might seem like a matter of personal choice today could become an implicitly coerced situation in which women not only can terminate, but might come to feel they must. And that's one issue. And then there is empirical evidence that obstetricians, midwives, genetic counselors, neonatologists, and others are not adequately trained to offer women a fully comprehensive, unbiased description of their options, and that prejudice against the disabled creeps into the ways in which these choices are framed for women. So that doesn't mean it's wrong to offer the choice. It just means we should be vigilant about honestly laying out the options. And there's been a lot written about how to do that in ways that would be fully comprehensive. The third concern that's been raised is the hardest to talk about, and in some ways, to me, the most intellectually interesting. I'm going to have to explain what I mean by that. It's the concern that we're headed into a brave new world where the goal is not only to prevent disabling conditions and ensure that all people have normal species functioning, that's what medicine usually is, right, to restore us to normal species functioning, but rather that there will be a perceived or expected moral obligation to go beyond normal species functioning, to become trans something, this is a transhumanist movement, to become better than human. Now, John Harris at the University of Manchester in the UK is a proponent of this. He's written that there is a moral obligation to pursue enhancements. And again, Julian Savulescu, whose quote I shared with you a minute ago, he goes even further than Harris, and he says that parents are morally obligated to use genetic and other kinds of technologies to make the best possible children, that they're morally obligated to make the best possible with genetic means and others. That's a pretty grand assertion, and I don't have time to explore it tonight. But I just want to mention two things. First of all, what one person feels is best is not what someone else thinks is best. And when conditions are socially stigmatizing, you can be pretty sure that they're unlikely to appear on the candidate list of best. So that's one problem with that. And the second is, if we take Harris and Savulescu at their word that there is an obligation to do everything in one's power to create the best children, and even if we could agree on what best means, there's still perhaps something to be lost in taking up such a quest. What could be lost? And here's the part that's hard to talk about, but I think a good place to sort of wind down this talk. Michael Sandel is a very thoughtful commentator. He's originally a political scientist, but he's really writing philosophy now. He's based at Harvard. And he's warned of what we see here. He's warned of hyper-agency. Now, agency is what makes us human, our ability to be agents of our own creation, our own destiny. Human agency is something to be celebrated. It's distinctly human, but hyper-agency can arise when parents feel they should control all aspects of their offspring. Rather than recognizing and relating to the child we are given, we could end up reinforcing within ourselves as parents a drive to overmaster, to achieve so-called perfection in our children, perfection at any cost. That could mean that we begin to treat children not as persons in their own right, we must love no matter how they come to us, but as objects that we can engineer. Now, hyper-agency can come in low-tech and high-tech forms. You know, we only have to look at how much we all want to get our kids into the right colleges or into the right nursery schools to see a low-tech version of perhaps hyper-agency. But it can also come in high-tech forms as people learn how to control their genetic destiny. And Sandel's written a beautiful book, a very, very controversial book, because many scientists don't want to acknowledge that hyperagency might be something that isn't good for children or for parents, but I recommend it to you. And so basically there are these three concerns that have been in the literature. The concern about discrimination against the disabled, the concern that we better make it that it's choice and that it's informed if we're going to base it on choice. And then this concern of are we going to do something to our own dispositions, that we won't accept what's given to us and we will feel that we must be the masters and engineers of our own children. So even because of those three reasons, even in a private eugenics based on choice as we have today, and the desire to enhance parental freedom through all the technologies that we have available to us, we're still left with many, many questions. I've raised 3 issues. There's a bunch of other ones. How far should parental discretion go? Should parents be able to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to select embryos on the basis of sex? Should deaf parents be able to discard embryos that will develop with normal hearing and choose instead embryos that would create persons like them who are deaf? And what if we detect genes associated with socially stigmatizing conditions like homosexuality? Should parents be able to prevent such births? And then what happens in the aggregate when hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, begin making reproductive decisions that result in certain kinds of children being born and not others? As genomic medicine advances, it will inevitably give rise to questions like the ones I've shared with you tonight. As I said at the start, these are questions that are not purely scientific. They are normative questions, meaning that they are about the values we hold and the goals we want to have and the kind of community we want to build. They require reflection about the intrinsic worth of diversity, about choice, what it really means, and how it can be sustained honestly. Reflection about the kinds of relationships we want to have with our children and the right our children have to open futures. These are questions that scientists alone cannot answer. But scientists have a really crucial role to play. I think that you are ideally situated to identify the questions about the purposes to which your research is put. In fact, I'm going to argue that if scientists don't think about the purposes to which their science is being put, then they're technicians. They're not really full professionals. So I'm arguing that scientists, including bioinformaticians and biomedical engineers, should be considering the purposes of their labor and its potential societal impact. And right now there are very few opportunities to prepare young scientists in training with the skills that are needed to think analytically about moral uncertainty. Professional preparation should be designed to include training in ethical analysis. And there is really a method to this. It's not just people's opinions. It's not just relativism or absolutism. There are ways of thinking. There are principles. There are sets of skills. There are frameworks that scientists have not been exposed to in any systematic way. So I think we need new ways to integrate that kind of education into the training of scientists. Public trust in genomic medicine requires that scientists work alongside philosophers and bioethicists and religious leaders, scientists who can recognize non-scientific questions, place their work in a broader context, and anticipate some of the social impacts. And for that reason, I was particularly delighted that Bob invited me to do this, because I feel like this is an example of scientists and non-scientists beginning a dialogue. And I very much hope that this is just the beginning, that there will be many ways for philosophers and bioethicists to integrate with the science that's going on in this amazing institution, and that this is just the start of how we might work together.